This is the vlog for December 15th, 2018. Take a listen to this. Did that sound familiar? It might not, and I don't blame you if it doesn't, because it comes from a movie with a much more famous sound effect. Let's see if I can't bring that up real fast.
This week at Target, save on hundreds of last-minute gifts.
All right.
Save on electronics.
That. Of course that would happen. That probably doesn't sound too familiar either, but that's because it's from the first movie, which was made in the 50s. And it took a while before they really zeroed in on the iconic roar. Now that probably sounds familiar. Godzilla and I have had a long relationship. Ever since my dad saw that I had a keen interest in dinosaurs from when I was 4 or 5 years old. He introduced me quite by accident. He found it streaming through some channels one day in our place in Minnesota and had me watch a little bit. And honestly, it scared me. I mean, that's not that big of a surprise. I was, I don't know, 6, 7, 5. I couldn't tell you exactly how old I was when I first saw Godzilla. And I didn't watch the whole movie because a lot of it is sort of boring. He just saw the monster fights, and to him, they always seemed kind of goofy. They looked a lot like people in suits just wrestling around and looking silly. But when you're younger and you don't have anything to compare it to, a lot of the camera tricks that they use to make everything look bigger, like using higher speed film to make everything seem to move slower, all the miniature work and the angles of the shots that are almost always tilted up so that you're sort of looking up at these creatures. These are all things that got used throughout Japanese media and tokusatsu for years after Godzilla sort of set the stage. You see it all the time in Power Rangers. You see it sometimes in Kamen Rider when they have a giant monster to deal with, although that's not as common on Kamen Rider. You see it in Ultraman, certainly. And even though it technically took place in a much smaller space, Gridman, aka Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad, also used the same sort of cinematographic tricks because it was made by the same guys who were doing Ultraman. But Godzilla really did start it all, and he really is king of the monsters. I think you ask anybody who's the biggest, meanest monster of all time, they're going to say Godzilla. And, you know, I'm just a white guy from Washington who grew up in Minnesota and moved back here when he was 12. But between Transformers and Gundam, between Dungeons and Dragons and comic books, I've always had a real love of Godzilla. I think there's something about him that excites the imagination. Something about the unpredictability of him. When he shows up, you know things are bad and they're probably going to get worse before they get better, because Godzilla is going to cause tons of collateral damage no matter where he goes or what he does. But because the collateral damage is fictional, it's not happening to you, you get to kind of enjoy it. You get to see him crush Tokyo for the 18th time. You get to see him wrestle with other monsters or just fight tanks, you know, kicking and stomping, tearing down the train lines and the power poles and all that stuff that he did back in the 1950s. That 1950s movie is legitimately scary, even by today's standards. A lot of the attacks take place at night, and it when you have a terrible thing happen in the middle of the day, that's bad. You don't want to have a house start burning. You don't want to have a windstorm. But let me be honest with you. You saw, if you watched my video last night when the power was out, there is something about night and darkness that makes natural disasters that much worse. And they really use that to full effect in that 1954 movie. And they didn't go back and do that same thing for a long time. I think the 1980s movie was one of the few that features a night attack of Godzilla. And remarkably, the 1999 Matthew Broderick American Godzilla has a lot of the action take place at night. And that's one of the few things that really works in that movie's favor. And it needs a lot of favors. But the 2014 movie does the same thing. The 2014 movie wisely gave Godzilla monsters to fight, because that's what we've become accustomed to as consumers of the Godzilla franchise. We want to see him assert his dominance as king of the monsters over other monsters. He has allies sometimes. Sometimes he's on the same side as Mothra or Angirius. Angirius is a really curious character. His vocalizations can be heard in a couple Super Nintendo games. The sound background in one of the characters in Super Street Fighter 2 uses his sound effect when the match is over. And Ridley from Super Metroid, of all characters, samples very much Angirius is the big armadillo spike-back shell guy. That's what he is. And he had a very distinctive sort of, and that's what Ridley sounded like on the Super Nintendo. But King Ghidorah is probably the most dangerous foe Godzilla's ever faced off against. I don't think he holds the record for the most commonly fought villain, because between all of the different Mechagodzilla versions, I think Mechagodzilla has probably fought him more than anybody. But King Ghidorah is just menacing in a way that a lot of different other monsters were. I'm personally a fan of Gigan. Gigan's a very goofy-looking, bird-mouthed, cyclopean, blade-armed thing. Space mutant, I want to say, is what he's usually called. He doesn't really look like anything. He looks like a big foam rubber monster. But King Ghidorah is this golden dragon with 3 heads, wings, and 2 tails. And if you listen to the creators talk, he's meant to be the terrible dragon Orochi from Japanese myth reimagined into a space monster. But he had, in his very first appearances, these very eerie alien sounds that didn't seem to fit a dragon that much, and that made him all the more unsettling. And let me just see if I can bring up that other video again. Because unlike Godzilla, whose roar has sort of changed in small ways over time, King Ghidorah's has actually changed pretty dramatically. This is the original sounds that I played earlier. Like I said, very alien, very unsettling. But when the whole film franchise got a minor reboot in the 90s, they reimagined King Ghidorah sounding like this. Now, that is, a lot of people could make the argument that that just sounds like sound distortion, and it does, and I'm sure that's part of what went into that vocalization. But what really works in that version of King Ghidorah's favor is that it sounds like a mouth making a sound that sounds like sound distortion, which is not something that we can do. And it sounds unnatural and yet intentional, as if a conscious effort is being made to create that sound at the same time. And that is just, that's a nightmare for me. That's the knowledge that there is something out there from another world, and its only want is our destruction. And the only thing that we can rely on to save us is the very thing we expect to destroy us, Godzilla. I'm really looking forward to the King of the Monsters movie that comes out next year in May, I believe, right around the same time as a lot of other big movies. But my love of Godzilla has put that particular film much higher on my hype list than a lot of others. It's right around there with Captain Marvel. Honestly, I'm more interested in Godzilla than Captain Marvel, but I am looking forward to Captain Marvel. I'm really hyped for that as well. But yeah, I'm still doing vlogs in May, and it might be, I don't know. You can expect to hear me gush about King of the Monsters or rant and rave at how they ruined Godzilla or something like that. Anyway, I've spent 11 minutes talking about Godzilla sound effects, so I'm going to leave you guys now and say I'm X Spornitz, and tomorrow will be better.